We are calling this Young Adults Gathering the Haven. So part of why we're calling it the Haven is that we're wanting it to be a safe space where people can really just be vulnerable about maybe some things that they're struggling with, but then also a place where we are asking that we would become more like Jesus, and it's a safe spot for us to become more like him. And we really just want just the overall goal of this thing to be, who is Jesus? And when we're here, we believe that Jesus was the Son of God. We believe that he came and died for our sins and saved us when we weren't able to do it on our own. And what we want to do here is we want to say, okay, then who was he? How did he live? How did he act? And how can we become more like that? So tonight what I want to talk about is this idea of offenses. I think in our day and age, offenses are happening all the time. I know that it is just a constant thing, especially that I'm seeing on social media, is people are always being offended or offending someone else or calling out something. We just live in an age where that's just something that I feel like is almost always happening. I know that a lot of times we can even get into that spot and we're getting offended by things that people aren't even saying to us. We're getting on and we're seeing something that someone said to someone on the other side of the world, and all of a sudden we're offended by it. Or we're seeing something that's happening somewhere else and we're all of a sudden thinking we need to say something about it, and we just throw an offense out at someone that we don't even know. And what I want us to realize is, I know even in my own heart, I see how often those offenses are happening, and sometimes I can think people need to just grow up and not be so easily offended. I'll see stuff, I'll be why were you so worried about that? You got to just let that go. But a lot of times I then get offended at how easily they were offended. And so then I just keep the cycle going, right? All of a sudden I'm going, you guys need to be tougher. You guys need to, and then I'm right back in the same cycle. I need to be tougher. I need to be in a different heart posture. But what I want to look at tonight is that we as Christians should really be countercultural to how the rest of the world is responding to things and how the rest of the world is interacting. In a lot of different ways, but especially in this idea of offenses that I want to look at tonight. And I know that part of it is that we need to not be offending others unrighteously. We need to make sure that we are not just going and hurting people's feelings, or that we're not going and just speaking negative things over people all the time. And so I want to look at this balance tonight, because I know sometimes those of you who maybe have grown up in church, you've heard people say people aren't going to like you if you follow Jesus. Or Jesus, he was always offending people all the time. And so then people get into this mindset of it's okay to just go and say whatever you want to people with whatever tone you want, because it's Jesus offended people too. But I want to look at the difference between an unrighteous offense and a righteous offense. And where I want to start, we want to look right at what Jesus is saying. Kicking off from the top, what does Jesus say about offenses? And here he's talking to his disciples. He said this to his disciples: offenses will certainly come, but woe to the one through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea, than for him to cause one of these little ones to stumble. Okay, so this is, I just know I read this and I'm just wow, it's intense. This is very obviously Jesus saying the way that we are offending people is not okay. But I know when I've read this in the past, I've read this verse, and this is the thought that I've had. Okay, so basically what Jesus is saying is make sure that you don't hurt anyone's feelings, or else I just wish you were dead. That's how I've read it. It's you better not ever hurt anyone's feelings, or it's I'm just angry at you, I just wish you were dead. That is not what he's saying. And even though that sounds kind of intense, what he's saying is even a little bit deeper than that. Because he's even going at a chord that's even a little bit lower than what that is. And so I want to try and read this in its context and see if we can figure out what he's talking about. The first thing that I want to point out is that he's talking to his disciples. So he's not just saying this to a bunch of people who don't know who he is and people that aren't believers. He's not going to them and saying, hey, make sure that you guys aren't offending people. I think this was a very specific and calculated conversation that he was having with the people that were in his inner circle, and with the people that he knew were going to be taking the gospel to others after he was gone. He was always focused on what the mission was, and he knew, I'm going to die for these people, and I need these disciples to go and share the good news with others. So this is actually some advice that he's giving specifically to those people. And when I looked at the word offenses, in the original language, this is part of what offense means. It's a trap or a stumbling block. And it means that you're causing someone to stumble or fall. Okay, now this is a little bit different, again, of a definition than what I thought that offenses was. I thought, like, to offend someone, it just means that you hurt their feelings. This is even deeper. It's saying that you actually are, like, setting a trap for them, and you're causing them to fall. So now let's look back at this and read it in that context. He's saying offenses, people being stumbled and tripped up on the life that they're living. The way that they're living and walking through life, the ideas that they have in their mind, whether they are a believer or if they're not, he's saying offenses are going to happen. You're going to have things that are going to kind of trip you up or trap you. But woe to the one through whom they come. So he's saying you should not be causing someone to stumble and move away from what the gospel is. He knew if there's someone who's not a believer, and you go and have a big argument with someone about something and it offends them and it pushes them away from Jesus, that's what he's talking about here. He's not just saying don't hurt their feelings. He's saying if you go and say something to one of these little ones, like it says, that means someone who's probably young or immature in the faith at the time, and you say something that causes them to go further away from him, he's saying at that point it would be better if you just didn't say anything at all. So again, he's not talking about like you would be dead instead. Like he's just trying to use really strong language to say it would be better if you said nothing at all, or if you never left your house, than for you to go and talk to someone and do something that's pulling them further away from a relationship with Jesus. So here's the analogy that came to my head. If I had someone that had fallen into a ditch, like they fell in a ditch and they need help out. So I throw a rope down to them and I'm trying to pull them up out of the ditch. If I'm trying to pull them up out of the ditch, if you were there with me, you have three options. You either can try to grab onto the rope too and help me pull them out. You can stand there and not do anything and you can just watch. Or you can go up and be like kicking me in the back of the knee and like trying to mess me up the whole time. You see what I'm saying? That's what Jesus is talking about right here. These offenses and these things that are causing people to trip up, we're actually working as Jesus is trying to pull them into relationship with him. We're actually pushing and making it harder for them to get out of where they're at. And that's what he's talking about. Does that make sense? Yeah. So an unrighteous offense, I call this the bait of Satan. And there's a book that's called The Bait of Satan that's really good. If you guys haven't read it, it's a really good book. But what he talks about is that, again, offenses are this idea of being a trap. And what Satan wants to do is he wants to come in and say, hey, you should say this to this person. Hey, this person did something to kind of hurt your feelings. You should stir this up right here. And it's the bait that Satan puts out. And then when we put it out, then it could be something that could pull people away. So if I'm sitting and scrolling on TikTok and something comes up and I see a video and I think the person seems like they're kind of lame and I get up there and try and type something random to them, like trying to be funny, but I'm bullying them, an offense, something that could pull them away. If I have someone that walks into me and they want to have a relationship with Jesus, but they have some lifestyle things that are not in line with Jesus, but I try and just go in and attack the thing that they're doing wrong and don't have any grace in it, again, an offense. If I go in and I have a coworker that maybe has kind of been getting on my nerves, and so then I go to another coworker and I'm like, oh man, like that dude is so frustrating, and I sit and stir up stuff. That's an offense. These are all things that we do sometimes subconsciously, but they're things that are potentially pulling people away from relationship with Jesus. So I think that we've set this up. We've said, okay, this is what we don't want to do. This is obviously the track that we don't want to take. So then if I don't want to be a trap, if I don't want to be a stumbling block, what do I do instead? And like I was saying at the beginning, like how do I be like Jesus then? If Jesus is saying don't do this, how do I become like Jesus? So then I want to look at this verse. This is what Paul says. He says, for the Jews ask for signs and the Greeks seek wisdom. but we preach Christ crucified. And this is what he says about Jesus. He says Jesus was a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. So this was really confusing for me. When I was doing the study for this, I was like, okay, sweet. That means we're not a stumbling block. And I was like, okay, so what was Jesus? And I go and look and it says he was a stumbling block. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't make sense. But again, let's look at the context, right? He was a stumbling block for who? For the Jews. These were the people who were already God's chosen people, and they had this idea of what they thought that it meant to follow God. And they had this whole list of things. But the path that they were on, they had set up their own rules about what it meant. They had added a bunch of things to the law that God did not have there. And they had made it into like kind of this country club. They made it into this thing that no one else was really able to do it like they were. And so what we see is that Jesus was actually a righteous stumbling block. They were on a path that was away from him, and Jesus was a stumbling block onto the right path. So there's actually a couple different ways that you can be a stumbling block, right? And then it also says he was foolishness to the Gentiles. The Gentiles were the people who were not at the time, God's chosen people. So they were not following any of the laws. They were not following any of the things that God had put into place. So if they would have heard Jesus talking, it would have been foolishness to them. Like they didn't have any context for him talking about the Sabbath or him talking about all kinds of different issues of things of the law and cleanliness and stuff like that. So then we see that there were two groups of people, the Jews and the Gentiles, that were both off track, and Jesus became a stumbling block for them to get back on track. So then there's this idea that we want to become a righteous stumbling block. We want to become like Jesus. It doesn't mean that we never offend people. It means that we never unrighteously offend people. It doesn't mean that we don't ever hurt people's feelings, because sometimes it is maybe going to hurt their feelings initially to hear some things. But it means that we're going in with truth and grace. We're not just running straight at people with a bunch of truth in a way that's going to push them away. But we're saying, you know what, I actually have experienced a grace that's different, and I want to show that to you, and I want to give you some truth about that. So here's another verse that connects with this. It's in 2 Timothy chapter 2. It says, again I say, don't get involved in foolish, ignorant arguments that only start fights. A servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but must be kind to everyone. They must be able to teach and be patient with difficult people. They're meant to gently instruct those who oppose the truth. And perhaps God will change those people's hearts and they will learn the truth. So when we're offended, if something happens to us that we don't like, if something happens to us that hurts our feelings, it doesn't mean we just have to sit and take it and act like nothing's wrong and try to keep a smile on our face and yeah, we're good. This is actually a very progressive approach. It's actually telling you a lot of things that you would go and do, but it's saying you're supposed to not quarrel, but be kind to everyone. You've got to be able to teach, which means I can't just go and yell at you about the stuff you're doing wrong. I've got to be able to actually explain it to you in a way that makes sense. And then the last thing is that we have to be able to gently instruct those who oppose the truth. And again, there's some things that are like, what I would say like capital T truths, and then there's things that are like lowercase t truths. And one thing that I think helps when we're trying to do this is so I want you to think about if there's 3 buckets. There's a first bucket, a second bucket, and a third bucket. And we take all of these truths that we have in our mind and we've got to try to sort them into these 3 buckets. So like in the first bucket is like Jesus was God. Jesus died for our sins. We like have first bucket issues that go right there. Those are the ones that really, really matter. And then we have second bucket issues, which are maybe like what my thoughts are on baptism, or what my thoughts are on creation, or like all of these are still important things, and they have to do with my relationship with Jesus, but they're in a different bucket. They're in that second bucket. And then the last thing would be the third bucket, which is maybe what I think about social issues, or how you should vote, or what I think about like different race issues or sex issues, like those go in the third bucket, or the fourth bucket or fifth bucket or sixth bucket, right? Like sometimes those things are way down the line. But if we put all of them into the first bucket and we say, okay, everything is as important as Jesus is God, then when someone comes to me and they maybe start talking and they cuss, and all of a sudden I flip out and I'm like, you can't do that. If you do that, you're going to go to hell. And I start to go crazy at them because I took something that was an opinion of mine and I put it in the first bucket and acted like it was the most important thing. Or I come across someone who I see on social media that I may not even know, and I see that they vote differently than me. And all of a sudden I'm in the comment section, hey, if you vote like that, you're not a Christian. I've seen people talk like that, like you're not a Christian unless you vote this way. Or if you vote this way, you don't really love Jesus like that. Do you guys see how these are unrighteous stumbling blocks? So part of the way that we can get back on track and be a righteous stumbling block is that we have to say, okay, what's actually most important? And I've got to take those first bucket issues, like I was saying, and I've got to be able to oppose those who are not on track with that gently. Then it doesn't mean I'm not causing them to shift, but that my shift is that I'm pulling them in. I'm not pushing them away and saying, you're not one of us. You come back when you've got it together. I'm pulling them in onto the path that I'm following Jesus. I think Jesus did such a good job of this. Part of the way that he did it in his ministry, you can see him constantly going back and forth and assessing situations and saying, is this one that's worth offending someone on, or is this one not? And you can see it. If you go read through the Gospels, you'll see him flipping back and forth the whole time. You see at the beginning, he goes into the temple and they're selling animals and things in the temple, and he saw how corrupt it was. And he went in and started flipping tables and going through and whipping. He had an idea there of, this is a first bucket issue that you guys are way, way off on. And I'm okay with maybe your feelings being hurt for a second, even just as long as it means that I can pull you back into me. And then after that, he's walking, and some religious people approached Peter and said, hey, is Jesus paying the temple tax? Which at the time was a tax that you would pay that would help upkeep the temple. They said, is Jesus paying the tax? And Peter, like he typically does, speaks way out of turn and goes, oh, yeah, he is, without really knowing if he actually did. So then he goes back to Jesus, and Jesus goes, I'm paraphrasing, but basically what he says is, why would I pay the temple tax if it's for me? Like he's like, the temple is actually made for me. Why would I need to pay it? But the next line that he says is, but so that we don't offend them, go and catch the first fish that you find. Once you catch that fish, it's going to have a coin in its mouth, and you can go and pay the tax. So one time he's flipping tables over. The next one he's going, nope, that was not worth offending over. And then he goes to the garden, and now he's in the garden, and Judas is betraying him. All of a sudden, he's in a spot of going, I know I could call angels down, and I could end this whole thing right now. He could have offended them in that point. He had a bigger picture. He knew what the first bucket issue was. He knew he had to go. So he kept quiet. And then he goes to the cross. And as they're taking him to the cross, they're going in and they're blindfolding him and beating him over the head. And they're beating him on the back. And they're saying, hey, you got to prophesy. Prophesy. Who's hitting you? Again, like, don't you feel that welling up in you of like, I would want to offend them? He knew the goal. And he kept quiet. And the crazy thing about that is, as they were beating him and saying, prophesy, the prophecy that he made about Peter was taking place at that time. Peter was right outside the gate going, oh yeah, I don't know who that guy is. He didn't want to righteously offend them. You see what I'm saying? He had to have been in a spot of like, they're gonna get upset. I don't know who that guy is. So as he was in a spot of going, I don't want to be a stumbling block, a righteous stumbling block, Jesus is getting beat, and as he knows that a prophecy is coming true at the same time, and they're saying prophesy, and he kept quiet. He knew it was going to defer. He knew it was going to distract from what was happening. They go to the cross and they've got the sign on it that says King of the Jews, and they're mocking him. They're saying stuff at him while he's up on the cross. He still is in his spot like, oh God, you've got to forgive him. And then he dies. He comes back to life. He's back with his disciples. And then that's when he says, okay, now it's time for you guys to go. You guys have got to go and make disciples now. With this in mind, and with the example that he set, he's like, you guys got to remember, like, this is not about all of these other things that you guys have been all tripped up on. This is something that's so much bigger than that. And I'm asking that you would oppose the truth in a gentle way, that you would be kind to everyone, and that you would teach them and not just go in and offend them. So this is the question that we've got to figure out. Where in our lives are we being an unrighteous stumbling block? Where are we doing things that just kind of feel normal to us, but it's actually pulling the people around us away from Jesus? And then what can we see in the example of Jesus that we go, okay, if I'm saying that he's my Lord and I want to be like him, how can I start to get in line with what he's doing and be a righteous stumbling block?